The trucks rattled across a long stretch of dirt road before halting near endless golden fields. The women inside sat still, their thin uniforms clinging to sweat and dust. None dared to ask where they were being taken. Fear had already answered for them. When the back door opened, sunlight flooded in. 6 Japanese women stepped down carefully, blinking against the glare. The guard said little, only gesturing toward a cluster of farm buildings in the distance. They expected barbed wire, maybe shouting, but found only quiet. The air smelled of soil and hay, not smoke or gun oil. A group of American farmers watched from afar, their faces unreadable. Aiko, the youngest, tried to stand tall, though her knees trembled. The eldest farmer, gray-bearded, sun-brown, stepped forward and spoke softly to the soldiers. His tone wasn't cruel. It was tired, cautious, human. When the guards left, the silence felt heavier than chains. The farmers remained uncertain yet unthreatening. One pointed toward a barn and motioned for the women to follow. Inside the barn, the light was dim and cool. Buckets of water sat waiting, steam rising faintly in the warm air. The women froze. They had been warned never to accept gifts from enemies. The oldest farmer dipped his cup into the bucket and drank deeply before setting it down for them. The gesture said more than words could. Hesitant, Aiko stepped forward and took a sip. It was clean, cold, alive. One by one, the others followed. They drank in silence, their eyes darting toward the door, half expecting a blow that never came. The men simply watched, quietly respectful, as though watering thirsty travelers. Then came food, thick slices of bread wrapped in linen. The smell filled the barn with warmth that felt almost like memory. The women stared at it as though it were a trick. Aiko tore off a piece and tasted it. The coarse bread softened on her tongue, heavy but good. She swallowed hard, her throat aching with more than hunger. The farmer gestured toward the fields beyond the barn. His meaning was clear. They would help harvest, not suffer. There were no guards left, no barking commands, only the quiet rustle of wheat in the wind. At dusk, they were shown their sleeping place, a loft above the barn with straw mats and blankets. The sight of blankets made several of the women cry softly into their hands. Aiko lay awake that night, staring at the beams above her head. She thought of her mother, of home, of how strange kindness felt after so much fear. As she drifted toward sleep, she whispered to herself, "They do not hate us." The words felt dangerous to believe, and yet, for the first time, they felt true. The next morning began with the soft glow of sunrise slipping through cracks in the barn walls. The women rose silently, unsure whether to wait for orders or begin work on their own. Outside, the farmers were already preparing tools, their voices calm and steady. Aiko stepped into the cool morning air and watched them hitch horses and sharpen sickles. One of the men, the same gray-haired farmer from before, handed her a blade and pointed toward the wheat fields. She hesitated, then bowed slightly and followed. The fields stretched endlessly, the golden heads of grain bending under their own weight. Aiko knelt beside the farmer as he showed her how to cut and gather. The motion was slow, rhythmic, so different from the chaos of war. When she tried, her hands shook. The sickle sliced awkwardly, scattering stalks instead of cleanly cutting them. The farmer smiled, took her hands gently, and adjusted her grip. It was the first time a man had touched her without command or cruelty. Soon the others joined, forming a quiet line across the field. The sound of blades slicing through wheat replaced the noise of fear in their heads. For the first time since capture, they were working not as prisoners, but as people. Hours passed. Sweat darkened their clothes and the sun burned their necks. Still, none complained. The farmers worked beside them, not watching, not ordering, just sharing the weight of labor. When noon came, a voice called them to rest beneath a large oak tree. Tin cups of water were passed around, and the women drank until their hands stopped trembling. The silence was no longer tense. It was peaceful. Lunch followed: rough bread, apples, and a pot of soup. The women waited for the men to eat first, but the farmers gestured for them to begin. Hunger won over hesitation. They ate slowly, tasting trust for the first time. Aiko looked across the field and caught the farmer's wife walking toward them with a basket. Inside were scarves and lemons for cooling water. The gesture was small, but powerful, a kindness that needed no translation. One of the women tried to bow, nearly spilling her cup. The farmer's wife smiled and helped her steady it. The moment was fragile, tender, two worlds meeting without words. When the work resumed, the women moved faster, their bodies remembering old rhythms of harvest back home. The wind carried bits of laughter between them, faint but real. For a while, the war felt far away. As the sun dipped low, the day's harvest lay in neat bundles across the ground. The farmers nodded in approval, their pride quiet but genuine. Aiko wiped her brow and realized she wasn't afraid anymore. That night, she wrote her first letter since capture. "Mother," she began, "I work in a field. The people here treat us gently. I do not understand why." She folded the letter carefully and hid it beneath her blanket. Tomorrow would bring more work, but tonight, the fear had loosened its grip. The enemy had offered her friendship, and that was the greatest shock of all. The days began to settle into rhythm: sunrise, work, water, and quiet evenings under a sky wide enough to make them forget the fences of war. The women no longer waited for guards. They followed the farmers into the fields willingly, their fear fading like mist. Aiko found peace in repetition. The sweep of the sickle, the whisper of wheat, the scent of dust, all of it began to feel like belonging. She didn't know the farmers' language, but she began to understand their silence. One morning, John, the oldest farmer, handed her a small packet of seeds. He pointed toward a corner of the yard where the soil was bare. "For you," he said simply. She didn't understand the words, but his smile was clear enough. Grow something. Aiko knelt by the dirt that afternoon, pressing the seeds into the earth. The action stirred something deep inside her, the same instinct her mother once had when planting rice at home. To nurture life instead of fighting death felt almost sacred. The others began planting too, small gardens behind the barn, rows of beans, tomatoes, and flowers. They had been prisoners of war, yet here they were, tending living things. It was the first act that made them feel human again. In the evenings, the farmers would sit outside and smoke, while the women wrote letters. The Americans had given them pencils and paper, saying the Red Cross would send the messages home. Few believed it, but still they wrote. Aiko's first letter was short. "Mother, I am alive. I work with kind people. I am treated well." She hesitated before finishing. The truth felt too strange to put on paper. But she wrote it anyway, hoping her mother would believe. When she showed her letter to one of the farmers, he nodded approvingly and carefully placed it with the others. No mockery, no control, only respect for her words. That simple gesture of trust was more powerful than any weapon. Weeks passed, and the seed sprouted. Green shoots poked through the soil, trembling but alive. The sight made the women laugh softly, like children rediscovering joy. Even the farmers seemed moved by their small victory. One afternoon, Mary, the farmer's wife, brought them scraps of cloth and thread. She taught them to stitch and mend, smiling as she guided their hands. the barn filled with soft conversation and the sound of fabric being sewn instead of orders being barked. The farmers began to trust them more openly. Tools were left unguarded, food shared freely. In return, the women worked harder, wanting to honor the kindness shown to them. Something invisible was forming. Not equality, but quiet respect. Aiko's English improved as she listened. She learned words like water, friend, and home. Each word felt like a bridge across an ocean of difference. She practiced them at night, whispering them as prayers. One evening, as the sky turned red with sunset, she looked over the fields they had harvested together. The crops swayed gently, glowing gold in the fading light. It was hard to tell where the farmers ended and the prisoners began. That night, Aiko dreamed not of war, but of soil, laughter, and seeds growing tall. She didn't know it yet, but those small gardens were doing more than feeding the camp. They were rebuilding something much harder to grow: trust. By the fourth week, the camp no longer felt like a camp at all. The fences that once marked separation now stood ignored, their barbs glinting harmlessly in the sun. The women moved freely between barn and field, trusted without question. It was Mary who first broke the silence that still lingered between them. One afternoon, she brought a radio out to the porch, setting it down beside a basket of mending. Soft country music drifted through the air. None of the women understood the lyrics, but the melody wrapped around them like warmth. Aiko sat close, her hands resting on her knees. When Mary caught her gaze, she smiled and began to hum along. Hesitant at first, Aiko followed, her quiet voice trembling. For the first time, sound connected them more deeply than words ever could. Later that evening, John joined them, his hat tilted low against the light. He handed the women slices of apple pie, laughing awkwardly when they stared in confusion. "Eat," he said, tapping the crust. "Sweet?" The word made Aiko smile. The laughter that followed was fragile, but real. It spread across the group like a small fire, warming faces that had forgotten how to smile. Even the farmers seemed surprised at how easy it felt. Enemies sharing dessert under a golden sky. The next morning, one of the women, Hannah, dared to greet John in halting English. "Good morning." He froze for a second, then chuckled softly and replied, "Morning." The exchange was brief, but it changed everything. Soon the women began learning words from the farmers. Bread, work, thank you. The men in turn tried clumsy Japanese phrases, laughing at their own mistakes. Every shared word chipped away at the invisible wall that had once divided them. In the evenings, the barn became a classroom. Mary drew pictures in the dust, teaching names for simple things: sky, bird, hand, friend. The women repeated them eagerly, their voices rising in unison. Language became a bridge, not a barrier. Aiko found herself talking more, not in fluent English, but with her eyes, her gestures, her smiles. The farmers responded in kind. The fear that once made her shrink now felt unnecessary, even absurd. One day, while harvesting, John accidentally nicked his palm on a broken stalk. Aiko rushed forward and wrapped his hand with a strip of her sleeve. The moment mirrored her first day in camp. Only now she was the one offering help. He thanked her quietly, his voice low. "Kind," he said, tapping his chest. "You kind." The simple words struck her harder than any declaration could. Kindness had become their shared language. At dusk, the group gathered near the garden they had planted. The flowers had begun to bloom, flashes of red and white against the green. The sight made Hannah whisper, "Beautiful." John repeated the word softly, as though learning it for the first time. They stood together in silence, watching the petals tremble in the wind. The world was still broken beyond the fields, but here, something gentle had begun to mend. That night, as crickets sang outside, Iko wrote another letter. Mother, they smile when we smile. They say my name kindly. I do not feel like a prisoner anymore. She sealed it and placed it beside her heart. A letter not just of survival, but of awakening. Autumn crept across the fields slowly, painting the wheat a deeper gold, and the trees along the road a rust-red hue. The harvest season was nearly over, and with it came a new energy on the farm, a sense of celebration. The women sensed it too, but didn't yet understand why. One morning, Mary arrived with bright scarves and baskets of corn. She handed each woman a scarf, smiling, motioning for them to wear it. Festival, she said, pointing to the sky, the barn, and her heart. The word was foreign, but the meaning felt familiar. By noon, the yard was alive with motion. Farmers brought out long tables. Children ran barefoot through the dust, and the women watched from the shade of the barn, uncertain if they were meant to join. Then John waved them over with a grin that left no room for doubt. At first, they stood apart, still shy, still unsure. But Mary placed bowls of soup in their hands, and when a local fiddler began to play, even the silence between strangers started to loosen. The women exchanged glances, half fear, half wonder. Iko sat beside Mary, who was teaching her to shell corn. They worked side by side, the rhythm of their hands matching the soft beat of the music. It wasn't just work. It was belonging disguised as labor. As the afternoon wore on, the farmers' children grew bold. One small boy offered Iko a slice of pie and waited nervously for her reaction. When she smiled and nodded, his face lit up, and he ran back to his mother shouting something joyful. Soon laughter echoed across the farmyard. The men told stories. The women listened, not understanding the words but feeling the warmth. Even Hannah, who had spoken the least, found herself laughing softly at a farmer's exaggerated gestures. When the fiddler switched to a slower tune, Mary extended a hand toward Iko. For a heartbeat, the world went still. Then Iko placed her hand in Mary's, and together they turned slowly beneath the fading light, moving in an awkward but tender dance. The others joined, not perfectly, not gracefully, but freely. Dust rose beneath their feet like smoke from an old fire, finally dying out. For a few minutes, there were no prisoners, no guards, no sides, only people celebrating the harvest they had shared. As twilight deepened, lanterns flickered along the fence line. The farmers sang softly, voices blending with the night wind. The women sat close together, their eyes reflecting the glow, their hearts full in ways they hadn't felt since before the war. John passed around mugs of cider. The sweetness was strange but comforting. Iko raised hers slightly toward him, mimicking his toast. "Good," she said simply. He smiled and nodded. "Yes, good." The air cooled, the stars brightened, and fatigue settled in gently. The women helped clear the tables, laughing at their own clumsiness. No one corrected them. Here, mistakes were allowed. As the music faded and people drifted home, Iko stood for a long moment at the edge of the field. She thought of how she had arrived, frightened, silent, waiting for cruelty. Now she stood beneath the same sky, surrounded by kindness she could neither explain nor deny. That night, she wrote in her letter, "Mother, the enemy dances with us. They feed us. They laugh. I do not understand how hate can end so quietly." She placed the letter by her bedside, the ink smudged by a single tear. Winter arrived without warning. The wind that once smelled of wheat now carried the sharp sting of frost. The fields lay bare, and the women spent more time inside the barn, mending clothes, cooking, and writing letters they weren't sure would ever find their way home. Snow came one morning, soft and slow. The women watched from the loft as the white flakes drifted down, blanketing the farm in silence. It was the first snow many of them had seen since childhood. For a moment, even captivity felt distant. Aiko had grown used to the rhythm of life here. Chores, laughter, small exchanges with the farmers that no longer felt foreign. Yet something inside her remained unsettled. The war might have ended, but its shadow still lived in every unspoken thought. One day, as she helped Mary knead dough, a soldier arrived on horseback. He carried a small stack of letters wrapped in twine. The sight made Aiko's heart leap. She recognized the Red Cross stamp. Mary smiled softly and motioned for her to come closer. The soldier handed Aiko an envelope worn at the corners. Her name was written in shaky Japanese ink. It was her own handwriting. The letter she had sent months ago. Returned. Undeliverable. She froze, her breath catching like glass in her chest. She opened it slowly as though afraid the paper might bite. Inside was her own message. Mother, I am alive. They treat me kindly, but across the bottom, in English, someone had written a single word. Deceased. Aiko didn't need translation. Her knees weakened. Mary caught her arm before she fell and guided her to a chair. No one spoke. The barn was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the soft, muffled sound of grief finding its voice. That night, Aiko sat awake long after the others had fallen asleep. The returned letter lay in her lap, its edges worn and soft. She traced her mother's name over and over until her tears blurred the ink completely. In the days that followed, she worked without speaking. The farmers noticed but did not intrude. John left small offerings near her workspace, a folded scarf, a cup of warm milk, a single apple, kindnesses that needed no acknowledgement. Slowly, the sorrow dulled. Aiko began to write again, though now her words were addressed to no one. Today it snowed, she wrote. Today I worked. Today I was not alone. Her letters became a diary of endurance, quiet and sincere. When she read them aloud to Hannah, the older woman nodded and said softly, "We live so our mothers do not die twice." It was the closest thing to prayer the women shared. Aiko pressed her palm to her chest and whispered the words until they felt true. The farmers built a small stove for the loft so the women wouldn't freeze. They brought old coats and patched them with wool. Each act of care filled the silence that grief had left behind. It was not pity. It was respect. By midwinter, the women began to smile again. They sang Japanese lullabies as they worked, and Mary hummed along, her accent clumsy but kind. The barn became a place of warmth against a world still recovering from its own coldness. On the final night of the year, Aiko buried her returned letter beneath the snow outside the barn. "Rest," she whispered to it. The wind carried her words into the darkness, and for the first time, she let the past drift away with it. Spring arrived quietly, almost shyly. The snow melted into streams that wound through the fields, and small green shoots began to rise from the soil the women had once planted. Life, it seemed, had not given up on them yet. Aiko spent her mornings by the garden, her fingers tracing the new leaves. The touch felt like forgiveness. She could almost hear her mother's voice in the wind, telling her to keep planting, keep living. The farmers worked beside them again, repairing fences and plowing fresh rows. There were no guards, no orders, only the rhythm of shovels and laughter. The earth accepted them all the same. American or Japanese, it did not care. One morning, John brought out a radio and set it on a barrel near the field. The broadcast crackled with news, peace talks, rebuilding, the long process of healing nations. The women didn't understand the words, but they recognized the tone, relief. Mary noticed Aiko watching and handed her a handful of flower seeds. "These," she said slowly, "for home." Aiko blinked, uncertain, until Mary pointed to her heart. Home wasn't a place anymore. It was the people who treated her as human. The women planted flowers along the edge of the farm. Red, white, and pale pink. Colors that seemed to echo flags, yet meant something gentler here. The blooms swayed together in the breeze, defying the idea of sides and borders. When a neighboring farmer visited, he frowned at the sight of Japanese women working freely. "You trust them?" he asked John. John simply nodded. "They've earned it?" The conversation ended there, settled not by argument, but by truth. A few days later, a truck arrived carrying supplies and a military officer. The women froze at the sight of the uniform, memories flashing sharp and painful. But the officer smiled and greeted them with a salute, respectful, not commanding. He spoke briefly with John, explaining that the war had ended officially months ago, and many prisoners would soon be sent home. The women listened, hearts torn between joy and fear. Home was no longer where they had left it. That night they gathered beneath the stars, speaking softly in their own language. "What if they hate us there?" one asked. Aiko looked toward the farmhouse, where light still glowed warmly. "Then we remember this," she said. The next morning, Mary gave each woman a small keepsake, a scarf, a spoon, a folded photo of the farm. "So you don't forget us," she whispered, her eyes bright with tears. Aiko pressed the photo to her chest. "Never," she managed to say. As the garden bloomed in full color, the women tended it with care, knowing it would be their final season here. Each petal felt like a farewell, each stem a promise that kindness would outlast distance. Before leaving, Aiko handed John an envelope. Inside was a note written in her careful English. "You showed me peace when I only knew war. I will never forget." He said nothing, only tipped his hat and smiled. The day they departed, the women looked back one last time at the barn, the garden, the fields. It had begun as a place of fear, but they were leaving it as a place of healing. The war had taken much, yet here it had returned a piece of their humanity. The truck arrived at dawn, its engine humming softly as the women gathered their few belongings. The air was thick with unspoken words, gratitude and sorrow mixing like breath and smoke. John helped lift their bags onto the truck bed, his hands shaking slightly. "You take care now," he said, voice rough with emotion. Mary hugged each woman tightly, pressing folded letters into their palms. "Write when you can," she whispered, though all knew the letters might never cross oceans. Aiko turned back one last time, her eyes tracing the barn, the fields, the patch of flowers they had planted together. The world beyond the fence felt uncertain again, but her heart no longer carried fear. As the truck rolled down the dirt road, the farmers waved until they vanished from sight. None of them had imagined friendship would hurt this much to leave behind. Days passed through empty roads and foreign towns. The women spoke little, each holding onto their memories like fragile glass. At one checkpoint, an American officer saluted them and said, "You helped our farmers more than you know." Aiko didn't understand the words, but she felt their kindness in his smile. When they reached the port, ships waited, vast and gray, symbols of both return and uncertainty. The women stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching their keepsakes close. Aiko looked down at the photograph Mary had given her. The farm bathed in sunlight. She realized it was not a picture of a place, but of a time when compassion had conquered hate. The sea air was cold, carrying the scent of salt and endings. One by one they boarded, their steps slow, their hearts heavier than their luggage. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Aiko leaned on the railing, watching the American coast grow small in the distance. She whispered softly, "Thank you," letting the wind carry it back. The women gathered below deck, exchanging the few words they could share. "Kind people," one said in broken English, and they all nodded. That night, under dim lamps, Aiko unfolded the letter she had written for John and Mary, but never sent. She read it silently, every word a prayer for the strangers who had given her back her faith in humanity. When dawn broke, the ship's horn sounded like a sigh across the ocean. The journey home had begun, but part of their hearts remained in those golden fields. Weeks later, Japan appeared on the horizon, a land both familiar and foreign. The women pressed against the railings, hearts racing with dread more than joy. Their towns lay in ruins, roofs caved in, streets hollowed by hunger and silence. The scent of ash still lingered in the air like memory refusing to fade. Aiko stepped onto the dock, clutching Mary's photograph tightly. Around her, families reunited, crying and shouting names she no longer remembered. When she reached what was left of her village, she found only empty walls and a single cherry tree still standing. It bloomed despite the rubble, a stubborn defiance she felt deep within. Neighbors whispered when they saw her uniform and the American markings. "Prisoner," they murmured, their faces a mix of pity and suspicion. She bowed quietly, saying nothing. There was no way to explain that captivity had been kinder than freedom's return. At night, she unfolded her letters and read them by candlelight. Each line was a thread tying her to the world beyond destruction. The farm, the laughter, the bread, they felt like a dream now. Yet that dream was what kept her from collapsing beneath the weight of the past.